Midterm prompt. Question 1. To what extent do you disagree with the characterization of populism as a contested concept? Be sure to discuss the ways in which populism has been defined and studied in your answer. Definitions. Mudd on populism. Mudd, 2004, argues that populism is an ideology that believes politics should be the general will of the people. It is divided into two opposites: elitism, which supports a vision of politics rooted in the elite, and pluralism, which rejects homogeneity and views politics as a process of different groups with varying interests. Populists use the term people to signify their commitments to a specific interpretation of reality. In liberal democracies, populists tend to adopt an anti-political party stance due to parties being the main representatives of the people. Populists are emancipatory and revolutionary in their aims, but do not aim to change the overall ideology or common sense of the people. Key takeaways. Kant. Populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, which is defined as popular sovereignty and majority rule combined with minority rights, rule of law, and separation of powers. It is democratic in its support for popular sovereignty and majority rule, but illiberal in disregarding minority rights, rule of law, and separation of powers. Undemocratic liberalism is the current neoliberal system of economics and government, where political power is increasingly delegated to economic arenas and international organizations. This has led to a weakening of the power of voters in the process of establishing laws and having a say in the ways they are implemented. Three different definitions of undemocratic liberalism are Laclau, Mudd, and Miller thin-centered ideology. Laclau. Laclau's populism consists of three key elements: the speech of a heterogeneous set of demands into a chain of equivalents, an empty descriptor representing this chain, and an aggressive dividing line between people on one side and those who would prevent them from fulfilling their demands on the other. Multiclass movements claim rights for the common people, highlighting authoritarianism and charismatic leadership. They don't fit into conventional political ideologies such as left v right or populism. Mudd. Populism is an ideology that views the elite as a single homogeneous corrupt group who are working against the general will of the people for self-serving reasons. It criticizes representative democracy and advocates for direct democracy such as plebiscites and referenda. Populists in liberal democracies tend to adopt an anti-political party stance, arguing that parties corrupt the link between political leaders and their supporters, divide the population for political gain, and serve their own interests at the expense of the people. Populism is a contested concept whose definition is contested due to actors not typically identifying themselves as populists. Muller. Populism and pluralism are antithetical, as populism is a form of identity politics and is exclusionary due to its categorization of individuals as either good or evil. Similarities. Laclau says doesn't fit with the right-left dichotomy. Mudd, the elite versus people. Muller says that it is an anti-establishment and an exclusionary practice due to categorizations. Methods of populist mobilization, for example personalist leadership, social movements, political parties. There are generally three mechanisms through which populist actors have tended to mobilize support. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. Personalist leadership, social movements, political parties. 1. The most common tactic of mobilization is using a charismatic leader to gain support through their personal appeal and engagement with supporters. 2. Social movements provide an opportunity for populist actors to succeed due to their tendency to divide society into supporters-opposers, such as the Occupy and anti-austerity movements. 3. Populism can operate through the political party system by challenging other parties on key issues or trying to force system change. Rising levels of support for populist parties demonstrate the demand for expanding the representativeness of the party families, but different electoral systems have implications for the extent to which challenger parties can exercise influence. Difficulties with studying populism, for example context dependence, transportability of Western concepts. Methods through which populism has been studied, for example strategy, ideology, discourse, performance. Populism as ideology. Mudd's approach to studying populism focuses on the content of leaders' ideologies, rather than their strategies of gaining support. It focuses on the moralistic vision of society that populists craft and how it is used to separate people into good and evil camps. Studies of populism focus on textual sources such as election and party manifestos and speeches to examine the extent to which populist messaging unfolds along the elite people axis. They also look at party systems and the changing dynamics around electoral coalitions. Populism as discourse. Populism is a discursive style of politics rooted in the elite-people relationship. The study of populism focuses on variations in the usage of populist messaging and understanding the style of their argument. Norris GPS is an example of measuring populism globally. Global Party Survey GPS Norris 2020. The GPS provides an innovative way of measuring populism internationally by charting the development of ideological values and issue positions of different types of political parties globally. The study relies on a rhetorical understanding of populism to make it more generalizable to a diverse set of cases. The dataset adopts a definition of populism as a rhetoric which espouses that legitimate authority comes only from the will of the people. Question 2. Evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the major hypotheses that have been put forward to explain the rise of populism in the contemporary era. Which of these hypotheses do you find least convincing? Post-industrial transformation of society hypothesis. The study of populism focuses on variations in the usage of populist messaging and understanding the style of their argument. Studies of the US have found that political candidates of both parties have been more likely to utilize populist discourse during the latter half of the 20th century. Norris GPS is an example of measuring populism globally. The post-1980s-90s has seen a shift away from first-dimension issue orientations and towards second-dimension orientations, which relate to economic issues such as labor market participation, wages, income and wealth redistribution, and welfare state benefits. The contemporary era has seen the realignment of traditional cleavages, leading to the emergence and success of smaller party families, such as populist left and right parties, shaped by demand and supply-side factors. Globalization and neoliberalism hypothesis. The transition to the neoliberal economic globalization model of the post-1980s era has caused voter dissatisfaction with mainstream political representation. This model is characterized by large-scale privatizations, deregulation, austerity, and the increasing financialization of the economy. This has been accompanied by massive declines in union membership and the political power of organized labor, as well as the outsourcing of jobs from higher-income countries to lower-income countries. The third way approach is an attempt to pair right-leaning economic policies with left-leaning social policies. Barrientos and Powell 2004. Argue that the processes of economic globalization have created winners and losers with different sets of political attitudes and desires. Increasingly, the winners have become the key constituency for mainstream parties, while the losers are becoming increasingly disaffected with such parties and seeking alternatives such as populist parties. Changing nature of the media hypothesis. The rise of populism is linked to the changing nature of the media and its relationship with consumers. Media companies have become increasingly tied to both state and corporate actors, hindering their ability to remain committed to objective reporting and increasing ideological biases in their reporting. This has resulted in rising levels of dissatisfaction with the media and a desire for alternative sources of information and news among large swathes of the electorate. Additionally, an increasingly educated population can undermine confidence in the mainstream media. The dissemination of populist ideas through different media channels and the rise of the fake news discourse has also provided populist actors with the opportunity to mobilize large numbers of voters around their causes and contribute to further polarization of society. Shocks crises hypothesis. Large-scale shocks have been hypothesized to influence the rise of populist actors in the political sphere. Two recent key crises that have had a significant effect on the emergence of populist rhetoric and success have been the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2015 migration crisis in Europe. The 2008 global financial crisis was a disastrous economic shock which resulted in populist actors' parties gaining massive levels of support and achieving electoral breakthroughs in many countries worldwide. The 2015 migration crisis had a similar effect on rising levels of support for populist parties, though much more in favor of right-wing populist parties. Schwartz crises are beneficial to populist parties as they tend to actively mediate the ways in which these events unfold and are perceived by the populace. Role of leadership is loose. Populist mobilization is the role of leadership that can mobilize masses of supporters and push through political reforms. Leaders have traditionally been viewed as charismatic strongmen who are independent of any office and free from constraint. They use tactics such as crafting an image of the leader as a person of action and rejecting expert advice. Anti-intellectualism, a sense of urgency, need for large-scale change, atypical communication style, and direct appeals to interactions with the common man. Insider populism is a type of populist leadership that comes from within the ranks of the political elite. Any questions, comments on the methods of mobilization used by populists and the role of leadership are welcome. Discursive style. Populism is a discursive style of politics rooted in the elite people dichotomy. It is used by political actors who use similar linguistic cues to espouse their ideologies, regardless of their ideological leanings. The focus of this approach is on the use of language to persuade large numbers of people to support a populist cause, rather than the individual. Individual actor. Political strategy. The most common tactic of mobilization is using a charismatic leader who claims themselves to be the representative of the people and the personification of the general will. This tactic is characterized by a top-down strategy in which leaders gain support through their personal appeal and through their engagement with supporters. Ideology. Populism is an ideology that views the elite as a single homogeneous corrupt group who are working against the general will of the people for self-serving reasons. Laclau on populism. Ernesto Laclau's 2005 understanding of populism is that it is a multi-class movement rooted in claims of equality and political rights for a common people. It is accompanied by authoritarianism and/or a charismatic leader, and two preconditions for its emergence are the formation of an internal antagonist and the emergence of a people with their own set of demands and plans to resist the antagonist. Laclau's concept of populism consists of three key elements: the articulation of a heterogeneous set of demands into a chain of equivalence, an empty signifier representing this chain of equivalence, and an antagonistic dividing line between the people on one side and those who would prevent them from fulfilling their demands on the other. The specific political nature and ways in which populism may manifest are dependent on the contexts in which they arise. The post-industrial transformation of societies. The rising standard of living and education rates in Western economies has led to a variety of emerging political attitudes and demands on the part of the electorate, which have incentivized the fracturing of mainstream party rule. The first dimension is more economic in relation to wealth distribution and wages, while the second dimension is post-materialist issues such as environmentalism, feminism and indigenous rights. Strength. Accurate for Europe and the transition after World War II in Western world, comprehensive on where parties' ideology of mainstream parties changed from first to second dimension. Weakness. Fails to cover Global South. First dimensions issue are still more pressing in the Global South than second dimensions. Globalization and the rise of neoliberalism. A focus on the winners and losers of globalization. Populists target the losers of globalization. In this, the left goes against neoliberalism. Strength. Provides context for how populist parties take advantage of cleavages to rise to power, explaining the voter dissatisfaction with mainstream political representation. Our blue-collar worker go for RWP because economic dissatisfaction. Weakness. Focuses on economic and not the social. Requires the other hypotheses. It's correct but doesn't cover everything. Changing role of and relation between media and population. In previous eras, the media was a more independent organization which was dedicated to a greater degree to an objective presentation of news and facts, but not so much anymore. Populist actors' disapproval of the elite revolves around disapproval of the political establishment, as well as the economic, cultural, and media establishment. Populists undermine the mainstream media. Strength. Can cover both the global north and south, an all-encompassing hypothesis. Highlights electoral tactics that populists use to get votes and accounts for the rise of populism in recent years. Gets more into the logistics of populist actors than the others. Weakness. To an extent, it relies on active mobilization of anti-media sentiment from populist actors to attempt to devalue the media, rather than the people necessarily having those sentiments themselves. Looks at populism simply as an electoral tactic, not necessarily an ideology or a belief system. Large-scale shock crisis. During periods of extreme difficulty, individuals may become more susceptible to certain messages and political agendas that both ascribe blame for a crisis and outline simple plans to address them. When people are in a more desperate situation, they will be more likely to resort to desperate measures. Economic shocks are more likely to lead to left-wing populism. Increases in immigration are more likely to lead to right-wing populism. Strength. It's an intuitive idea. It explains specific sudden rises of populism after certain events. It can even have an almost predictive quality maybe. Also highlights the thin-scented ideologies that populists employ. Right and left-wing populism can both emerge from the same event. Explains how populists provide elite cues. Explains populism as an electoral tactic. Weakness. Very limited in use. Of course, it only explains populism when there is a shock. Its context-dependent lack of accounting for economic aspects of populism. Ignore the historical context of populism. Question 3. What are the key causes and characteristics of left-wing populism, and to what extent are these factors similar different in the global north and global south context? Chantal Mouffe on the rise of left-wing populism. Populist moment. Post-democracy. Conceptualizing left-wing populism. Chantal Mouffe on left-wing populism. Left-wing populism is a response to the populist moment, a crisis of neoliberal hegemony that has led to the erosion of two pillars of democracy, equality and popular sovereignty. Mouffe's left-wing populism is a discursive strategy of populism which establishes its political frontiers on the conflict between the people and the oligarchy with the goal of deepening democracy. The populist moment is characterized by an emerging set of demands that no longer correspond to definitive social categories. Oscar Garcia on the rise of left-wing populism. Party system crisis, corruption, political movements. A definition of left-wing populism. Together, these factors provide for a definition of left-wing populism as outlined by Oscar Garcia 2020. Left-wing populism is a combination of a populist motive and the desire to expand democratic representation through appeal to the people against the elites and the left-wing tradition of promoting equality and social justice. Historically, the focus of left-wing populism has been confined to a critique of the neoliberal economic order due to its inherently political nature. Contemporary left-wing populism's push for greater representation includes a variety of issues such as gender equality, immigration, climate change, and the advancement of human rights. Over time, the focus of left-wing populism has shifted away from a purely economic-oriented critique of neoliberalism to a more expansive movement for democratic expansion, aiming at providing democratic rights and freedoms to historically oppressed and marginalized communities. Characteristics of left-wing populism. Ultimately, contemporary left-wing populism entails three major characteristics. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is transversality, where the goal of achieving greater levels of representation requires the agendas and proposals of left-wing populists to go beyond the typical left versus right dichotomy which has historically defined the electoral and political domains. For example, democracy versus neoliberalism. The second is inclusiveness, where the goal of advocating for the representation of a plurality of diverse interests in society requires that populism breaks free from its conceptualization as an inherently anti-pluralist phenomenon. For example, mobilization beyond class identity. The third is participation, where direct democratic participation and representation are key aspects to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives. Crisis of representation. Chantal Mouffe's assertion that we are living in a populist moment is based on a crisis of representation caused by the party system, corruption, and social movements. Populists on the left oppose idealized notions of liberal and representative democracy due to a representation gap, leading to a crisis of representation. Key features of the European populist left. Defining features of the contemporary European populist left. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is that it seeks to be an alternative to social democracy. The second is that it seeks to be an alternative to right-wing populism. The third is that it has been utilized by parties of the center-left. The fourth is that it relies on charismatic relationship. And the fifth is that they represent movement parties. Alternative to social democracy. The crisis of social democracy has led to the emergence of movements and political parties seeking to replace it. This has been demonstrated by the transition towards third-way politics and the decline of mainstream parties. The populist left has the potential to mobilize an electorate large enough to overtake the mainstream left. Parties have adopted the idea of redefining social democracy by reaffirming its key tenets and replacing them with a new vision for political and economic democracy. Alternative to right-wing populism. The decline of social democratic parties has led to the emergence of other party families such as the populist right, which are now more influential than left-wing populist parties. Left-wing populist parties seek to provide an alternative direction for Europe that moves away from the divisive and harmful agendas of the radical right. Jeremy Corbyn's agenda focused on a people-elite dichotomy focusing on British workers and a fight against neoliberalism and austerity while trying to reverse third-way politics. Charismatic leadership. Left-wing populism in Europe relies heavily on charismatic leaders, such as Alexis Tsipras and Pablo Iglesias, who have led Syriza and Podemos to historic electoral victories. It is argued that these leaders would not have been successful without their influence. Movement parties. Left-wing populism in Europe is characterized by large-scale social movements demanding political representation. The most influential movements in recent history are those in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, which have resulted in important electoral victories for populist left parties in France, Spain, and Greece. Supporters of the populist left in Europe. Studies have found that younger voters with higher levels of education and those who reside in urban city centers are more likely to support left-wing populist parties than right-wing populist parties. The losers of globalization are more likely to support right-wing populist parties, while the winners are more likely to support green, liberal, and mainstream center-left parties. Skepticism towards the EU has also been predictive of support for the populist left. Transversality, inclusiveness, participation. Characteristics of left-wing populism. Contemporary left-wing populism entails three major characteristics: transversality, inclusiveness, and participation. Transversality is the goal of greater representation. Inclusiveness is advocating for diverse interests, and participation is key to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives. Left-wing populism and the socialist tradition. Left-wing populism is heavily influenced by socialist traditions, as socialism itself has been seen as intrinsically populist. Socialist parties have attempted to mobilize voters using a class-based strategy that draws on the Marxist tradition of the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisies. The focus of left-wing populism is increasingly on an inclusive agenda of egalitarianism, with economic and class-based issues and interests playing a central but not the only role. Left-wing populists are advocating for more substantive representation due to their critique of liberal democracy, which has led to a representation gap in which many people feel less represented. The democratic vision of left populists is rooted in a notion of economic democracy, which is concerned with creating a society oriented towards human equality and social justice, rather than the generation of profits and wealth maximization. In Europe, arose out of new politics of post-industrial transformations and decline of mainstream parties. Third way, collapse of communism, EU expansion, shocks crises left-wing populism in Europe. Left-wing populist parties in Europe emerged in the 1990s due to the new politics era, where mainstream parties were seen as having sold out to the establishment and abandoned their supporters. Part of the populist backlash was rooted in the rise of third-way approaches adopted by major parties in the aftermath of the decline of the Keynesian economic consensus and the transition to the neoliberal economic model. Social democratic parties' shift towards the economic right has caused voters to look for alternative sources of political representation, leading to the rise of left-wing populist alternatives. In Latin America, three waves of populism from 1929. Contemporary era left-wing populism in Latin America. The rise of populism in Latin America. MUD. Latin America has the strongest historical traditions of left-wing populism, and is home to some of the strongest left-wing movements in the world. This is due to higher levels of socio-economic inequality in the region, which has made left-wing populism a staple of the political sphere for some time. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1960 caused a crisis of incorporation in the region, leading to demands for social and political rights. This was the initial era of leftist populism in Brazil and Ecuador. MUD, the era of import substitution industrialization, IC, was associated with a nationalistic leftist agenda advocating for socio-economic development through state-led initiatives and social democratic reforms. The Latin American populist left was strongly supportive of the notion that class consciousness and politics was a predominant cleavage. The second wave of populism emerged in the early 1990s due to economic crises, where populist leaders were able to gain electoral victories by blaming the elite. The third wave of populism was ushered in with the 1998 victory of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which was characterized by an anti-neoliberal, anti-American populism rooted in 21st century socialism. They view themselves as radical leftists dedicated to fighting against excessive free market reforms and neoliberalism with the aim of uplifting the poorest in society. They are committed to the expansion of democratic rights and the establishment of participatory democracy. Contemporary causes: social inequality, neoliberalism, electoral politics, indigenous rights, social inequality. Historically speaking, the region has had some of the highest levels of social inequality in the world. This continues to be the case today. History of colonialism and the influence of colonial institutions on long-term development. Emergence of neoliberalism. Dependency theory. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic and political ideology that emphasizes deregulation, privatization, austerity measures, rolling back of state services, and financialization. It advocates for individual freedom and expression and the support of markets as the best means to expand individual freedom and success. It has been critiqued for its tendency to create high levels of inequality, its subversion of the political realm to the economic realm, and its hostility towards organized labor. It has also been criticized for concentrating power in the hands of financial elites and multinational corporations and international organizations. Electoral politics. The institutionalization of electoral politics and the use of elections as the main way to organize the political sphere provided new party families like the populist left with the ability to compete for office. This, combined with declining levels of support for center-right parties, provided new opportunities for parties to craft new electoral coalitions. The struggle for indigenous rights. The struggle for indigenous rights is rooted in the region's colonial past and the institutionalization of exploitative and racially based hierarchies. Since the 1990s, large-scale indigenous social movements have erupted and demanded the rights of sovereignty and self-determination. In the modern era, indigenous protest movements have achieved various degrees of success in meeting their demands and becoming represented in national politics. It has often been through the populist left that such movements have found more success in the political realm. Social inequality. Historically speaking, the region has had some of the highest levels of social inequality in the world. This continues to be the case today. History of colonialism and the influence of colonial institutions on long-term development. Emergence of neoliberalism. Dependency theory. Three types of regimes: orthodox, statist, heterodox, and democratic governance: liberal democratic, radical democratic, plebiscitarian. In particular, three types of economic policy regimes have been implemented by these actors according to Levitsky and Way, 2011. Orthodox regimes, statist regimes, heterodox regimes. First, orthodox regimes in Brazil are those that adhere to neoliberalism and make investments in social policies to reduce inequality, such as privatization and trade liberalization. Examples include the Bolsa Familiar and the PT. Second, statist regimes are characterized by high levels of state control of the economy and policies, such as nationalization, creation of state-run firms, regulation of FDI, and investments in social policy. Lastly, heterodox regimes such as those under Rafael Correa in Ecuador engage in both orthodox and measures. The varieties of left populist rule in the 21st century have differed in their models of democratic governance, with liberal democratic regimes institutionalizing pluralism and radical democratic regimes combining it with new channels of popular participation. Question 4. What are the key causes and characteristics of right-wing populism, and to what extent are these factors similar different in the global north and global south contexts? Typology of the populist right. In the European context, there are several varieties of right-wing populist parties. Pilinka 2013. The European context has several varieties of right-wing populist parties, such as the Austrian FP and the Dutch PVV. The Austrian FP is rooted in a pan-German tradition and became a centerpiece for Nazism in the 20th century, while the Dutch PVV emerged in the aftermath of PIM Fortuyn as a single-issue party focused on anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim agendas. The second are right-wing populist parties with a national revisionist agenda. The most extreme right-wing populist parties in Europe are those that have a history of or are rooted in support for fascism and leaders such as Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler. These parties often reject liberal democracy and the concept of universal human rights, and advocate for their agendas on the grounds of racial and ethnic superiority. Examples include the German NPD, the Golden Dawn in Greece, and the British National Party in the third group are right-wing populist parties of Western and post-communist Europe. The Nordic countries have traditionally been seen as safe havens from the far right, but the emergence of parties such as the Danish People's Party, Sweden Democrats, True Finns, and Norwegian Progressive Party since the 1980s has given rise to anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment. Post-Soviet countries have also seen rising support for the populist right in countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and Hungary, which have strong ethno-nationalist politics and reject the EU project. Hungary and Poland are two countries in which the populist right fully governs. Conceptualizing right-wing populism. Key variables for understanding right-wing populism. A comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon of right-wing populism requires a multifaceted approach which pays attention to three important variables. Onnes and Cutley 2020. 1. Economic variables. 2. Identity cultural variables. 3. Domestic foreign policy variables. Populists on the right emphasize anti-elite sentiment and dissatisfaction with the political and economic establishment, but tend to have close relationships with business interests and govern under elite-driven agendas while still relying on anti-elite rhetoric to win public support. This is similar to their counterparts on the left. Economic and cultural dimensions. Both economic and cultural factors are vital to understanding the rise of the populist right, and the economic versus cultural backlash hypothesis alone is not suitable to explaining the phenomenon. The success of right-wing populists is often rooted in a combination of economic concerns and identity politics centered around religious, nationalist, and xenophobic rhetoric. 1. Such ideas are used to form the electoral coalitions needed to succeed despite the inconsistencies between their rhetoric and actions, that is, close connections with the elite. Thus, outside of the use of populist rhetoric, right-wing populism, with a focus on an exclusionary agenda, is fundamentally different than left-wing populism with its focus on an inclusionary agenda. Economic and cultural dimensions. Right-wing populists are exclusionary due to their strategy of polarization and division based on anti-pluralist discourse and exclusive nationalism. They often use nationalism as a means of uniting different groups whose interests may otherwise be antithetical to one another. The success of these parties is dependent on positioning themselves as representatives of the majority against the elites and painting their opposition as part of the establishment. The nationalist religious overtone of right-wing populism is particularly salient in the global south, while a religious ethnic overtone is more salient in the global north. Vertical redistribution, that is using economic resources to finance their partnerships with business elites. Horizontal redistribution, that is using economic growth to finance social policies for the electorate, that together create a cross-class coalition that keeps them in power. Right-wing populist governments often come to power with promises of reducing economic inequality and improving material conditions. However, once in power, their economic records tend to be characterized by persistently high inequality and corruption, but are more resilient than their left-wing counterparts. The data does not suggest that right-wing populist governments are successful at substantially reducing inequality. Rather, wealth and income inequality are hallmarks of societies in which right-wing populists have governed for long periods of time. The policy regimes of these governments tend to benefit the wealthiest members of society, such as Trump's 2017 tax cuts. Domestic foreign policy dimensions. The domestic foreign policy arenas are also important to right-wing populists who often draw on aggressive foreign policy styles as a way of increasing their support at home and as a way of diverting voter attention away from the shortcomings of their domestic political and economic agendas. Related to this dimension is the issue of a nationalist-globalist dichotomy. Although right-wing populists are both nativist and nationalist, they are not exclusively anti-globalization but rather desire a new kind of transnational political order. The contemporary populist right, anti-elitist, ethno-nationalist response to globalization. Right-wing populists draw on aggressive foreign policy styles to increase their support at home and divert voter attention away from their domestic agendas. This is related to a nationalist-globalist dichotomy, as right-wing populists are both nativist and nationalist, but not exclusively anti-globalization. Inglehart and Norris's Silent Revolution in Reverse Explanation. The Silent Revolution thesis argued that rising levels of physical and material security in the post-war era opened up the electorate to new ideas and tolerance for out-group members, while material insecurity had the opposite effect. This era gave rise to a large-scale shift towards post-material values which emphasized the need to pursue social justice for historically excluded issues and societal groups. This trend was explained by two hypotheses: the scarcity hypothesis, economic decline reverses this trend, and the socialization hypothesis, values reflect pre-adult life conditions and change through intergenerational replacement. In Europe, nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism were characterized by nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism, which explain why the silent revolution did not manifest in low-income and poorer countries. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, the populist rights movements towards pro-market positions and towards authoritarianism was successful in attracting the votes of key electorates. The 1990s saw a shift in support for right-wing populist parties, with voters most supportive of them reverting to center-left economic views and right-wing to far-right-wing socio-cultural views. This shift has been argued to be the new winning formula for right-wing populist parties. The defining policy feature of right-wing populist parties on this new dimension is that of welfare chauvinism. Typology of European right-wing populist parties. 1. With pre-populist roots, FPO diaresis. 2. Without pre-populist roots, PVV. 3. With national revisionism, NPD. Golden Dawn, BNP. 4. Post-communist Nordic, Hungary, Scandinavia. The changing agendas of the European right-wing populist parties. 1. Winning formula 1980s-1990s of right-wing economic agenda and right-wing socio-cultural agenda. 2. New winning formula post-1990s of center-to-center-left economic agenda and right-wing socio-cultural agenda. The contemporary populist right electorate. There are 6 key demographic predictors that have been found to influence support for the populist right. Alekia Paulau and Landis 2022. The first is that support for these parties is concentrated among older male voters. The second is that those on the lowest income strata are less likely to support these parties. Third is that although receiving unemployment benefits is positively associated with support for these parties, the relationship is not statistically significant when controlling for major attitudinal factors. Fourth is that managers are less likely to support these parties, whereas those employed in agriculture, craft occupations, and lower skilled operators are more likely to support these parties. Fifth is that individuals in urban areas are less likely to support these parties than those in rural areas. And sixth, individuals with higher levels of education are less likely to support these parties relative to those with lower levels of education. The historical context of right-wing populism in Europe. The populist right has emerged as a viable electoral actor in Europe since the 1990s, responding to rising frustrations over European politics and society, as well as European integration and large-scale immigration. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Right-wing populism in the Global South. 1. Lack of support for neoliberal globalization hypothesis. 2. Neoliberalism and anti-elitist, offensive populism. 3. Growth-oriented model. 5. Religious, ethno-nationalism. The neoliberal globalization hypothesis has been central to the development of right-wing populism in Europe and left-wing populism in the Global South. This has led to a lack of applicability in the Global South. Kumral 2022. Neoliberal globalization does not equally penetrate countries across the world, leading to a different set of circumstances for the success of the populist right. This has led to a different set of circumstances for the populist right. Similarities. Question 5. What is the relationship between populism and democracy? What are the major ways in which the two are complementary and antithetical to one another? Does this relationship differ based on the nature of populism? That is left right-wing, two streams, incompatible, for example Muller, and compatible. Democracy and populism. There are two major streams of thought on the relationship between democracy and populism. One view is that populism and democracy are compatible due to its ability to unite and give a political voice to marginalized groups and restrain the elite's power. Populists may promote expansionary mechanisms of representation such as referenda and plebiscites. Another view is that populism and democracy are incompatible given the common ties between populist governance and authoritarianism. Inglehart and Norris, 2017, suggests that the resurgence of authoritarian populists is likely to grow stronger due to rising income insecurity and innovations in artificial intelligence and automation. This shift towards an artificial intelligence society could have similar effects as the previous shift from the post-war economy to the knowledge economy. When it comes to the democratizing process, the effects of populist politics can have three effects. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Liberalization, democratic transition, democratic deepening. When it comes to the de-democratizing process, the effects of populist politics can also have three effects. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Democratic erosion, democratic breakdown, repressiveness, democratization, liberalization. The process of liberalization occurs in authoritarianism, where populism is used to loosen restrictions and expand individual and group rights. It can act as a frame of opposition which articulates people's demands for popular sovereignty and majority rule. This process occurs during the transition from a fully or partially authoritarian regime to an electoral democracy, where populism fosters the idea that voters should elect their leaders. An example of this is the formation of the Party of the Democratic Revolution (PRD) in Mexico in 1989 due to its refusal to support free and fair elections. Democratization cont. Democratic deepening. The process of authoritarian to democratic evolution involves the use of populism as a means of demanding and improving participatory institutions and protecting fundamental rights and freedoms. Examples of this process can be found in Eastern European countries transitioning to democratic regimes and EU membership, such as Slovakia. Populism can lead to a democratic erosion of fundamental rights and institutions, such as the judiciary, the rule of law, and minority rights. An example of this is Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, which implemented reforms that have undermined Hungarian democracy after coming to power. Democratic breakdown. This process is a transition from an electoral democracy to a competitive authoritarian regime, where populism is used to tilt the rules of the game to the benefit of the populist actors. An example of this is Alberto Fujimori regime in Peru. which suspended the country's constitution and closed parliament in the name of the people to circumvent electoral competition. De-democratization. Repressiveness. This process marks the transition from competitive authoritarianism to full authoritarianism, in which populism is used by the faction seeking power to fully capture the institutions of the state and governance. Alexander Lukashenko's regime in Belarus is an example of this transition. The three phases of democratic erosion, democratic breakdown, and repressiveness constitute the ways in which populism has been used in the process of democratic to authoritarian evolution. Common dimensions of inclusion-exclusion: material, symbolic, political. A key mechanism has facilitated this change. 1. Birth cohort effects, in which the younger generations who had grown up under more secure conditions in the aftermath of the Second World War began to replace the older generation whose ideas had been shaped by 2 world wars as well as the Great Depression. 2. Over time, the emergence of a material post-material cleavage provoked a reaction among older and less materially secure voters who felt threatened and left behind by the displacement of traditional values. Thus, a materialist reaction against post-materialism developed, which led to the emergence of xenophobic and authoritarian right-wing populist parties, as well as a decline in class-based voting. The transition from competitive authoritarianism to full authoritarianism is marked by the use of populism to capture the institutions of the state and governance. The post-material shift was particularly influential for the politics of the left, which was largely a working-class movement dedicated to the redistribution of income. Social democratic parties adopted left-libertarian values and used them to attract the support of increasingly middle-class post-material voters by the 1990s, leading to de-alignment among large sections of working-class voters. Social democratic parties have become increasingly dependent on the emerging post-material electorate, leading to a decline in party support and voting. The key cause of support for right-wing populist parties is anxiety that rising levels of cultural change and increasing rates of immigration are eroding traditional values and cultural norms. Ingrid Houghton Norris, 2017, suggests that the resurgence of authoritarian populists is likely to grow stronger due to rising levels of income insecurity among some of the most vulnerable people, as well as innovations in artificial intelligence and automation. The majority of the 20th century saw working-class voters support parties of the left, while middle and upper-class voters supported parties of the right. However, the post-material era brought with it declining emphasis on materialist issues and growing emphasis on post-materialist issues, leading to a counter-movement among some segments of working-class voters who increasingly moved to the right in defense of traditional values and nationalism. Social democratic parties adopted left-libertarian values to attract the support of increasingly middle-class post-material voters in the 1990s, which resulted in de-alignment among working-class voters in the policy agendas of these parties. Emphasized the politics of class in favor of more progressive socio-cultural agendas. The constituencies most overrepresented within the contemporary populist rights electorate are the petty bourgeoisie, older voters, male voters with low levels of education, and members of the religious and ethnic majority group. The key cause of support for right-wing populist parties across Western Europe is anxiety that rising levels of cultural change and increasing rates of immigration are eroding traditional values and cultural norms, but its persistently higher levels. Ingrid Houghton Norris, 2017, suggests that the resurgence of authoritarian populists is likely to grow stronger due to rising income insecurity among some of the most vulnerable people. Additionally, innovations in artificial intelligence and automation have begun to threaten the economic positions of those who are better off. This shift towards an artificial intelligence society could have similar effects as the previous shift from the post-war economy to the knowledge economy.